Hello and welcome to the English Department Applicants event. I'm Richard Vardy, I'm the Head of English, and I'll be leading you through the event this evening. I'm also joined by 4 current students who are going to introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Edouard and I study English literature.
Hi, I'm Alice. I study English literature and language.
Hi, I'm Emily and I study English literature.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I study English language and literature.
Okay, thank you. So the purposes of today's event, the main purpose is to introduce you to the department and the 2 courses that we offer, English literature and English language and literature. I'll spend some time explaining the differences between the 2 and the similarities, but the main focus of the event is to model some of the approaches we take in a typical English lesson. We'll start with English literature and modelling how we approach the study of texts on English literature before moving on to the language and literature course, and again modelling how we will approach that. We'll also have a chance for the 4 students who you just met to talk about English from their perspective as well. At the end, there will be a question and answer session. So in the question and answer tab, if you write any questions that come to mind, and we'll endeavour to answer them at the end of the session. So I just thought I'd begin with an introduction to the department itself. It's a very successful department. We in pre and now hopefully post-COVID world, we run a range of trips, especially to the theatre, and we have visits and talks and lectures from universities. We also have currently 2 enrichment clubs. We have a reading group and a creative writing club as well. So for students who are particularly interested in those things, then we really help and support and have a community going. We also have plus classes as well. That they are extra classes to help support students who might be falling behind or might want to push on to the very top grades. So, as I say, I'm just going to talk briefly about the differences between the English literature and the language and literature course. It's possible you came to the open evening where we would have probably explained the differences to you there, and the fine details of the assessment and of the units are all on the website. So I'm not going to go into too much detail today, but I just think it's useful just to begin by clarifying the main differences between these 2 courses. So English literature is, as you might expect, it's a study of English literature. So we look at plays, including Shakespeare, and we look at poetry, and we look at novels. On the language and literature course, we do study literature as well, including Shakespeare and modern drama and novels as well. But on the language and literature course, there's no poetry. Instead, in many ways, you can look at it as the poetry is replaced by, or the equivalent is the study of non-fiction. So both written and spoken. So it's looking at things like memoirs and interviews and speeches and so on. It's largely on an anthology which the exam will provide of non-fiction texts, but also other unseen non-fiction as well. The way in which the courses are assessed is exactly the same, so 80% exam and 20% coursework. Language and literature, for what it's worth, has 2 exams, and literature has 3 exams, but the language and literature exams are slightly longer. On the literature course, you are largely assessed through essays, entirely assessed through essays and essay writing. Language and literature, it is mostly essay-based, but for the coursework, and this is where there is an important distinguishing difference between the 2. The coursework for language and literature is an opportunity for you to demonstrate your skills and expertise in creative writing. That's both fiction and non-fiction. The skills that you're assessed on, again, are similar, but a key difference here is for the literature course, we look at alternative readings. Well, I'm going to go through what we mean by that in a little bit later when we look at the John Keats sonnet. Where that skill isn't assessed on the language and literature course. And another important difference on the language and literature course is a focus on language frameworks. That's looking at language with a sort of magnifying glass, really, and really taking apart and looking at the grammar, the construction of the phrases and the sentences and the vocabulary of the text in a much more sort of forensic detail. So that's, in 2 minutes, a summary of the differences between the two courses. And hopefully over the next half an hour or so, as we go through a model of the differences in approach, you will have a clearer sense of what's involved on a literature course and what's involved on the language and literature course. So I'm going to pass over now to our students who will talk a little bit about English from their perspective. Yeah, so over to you.
Yes, so I study literature, and in general, I first chose it because I preferred the idea of studying novels, preferred the idea of studying poetry, and wasn't as keen on doing creative writing for coursework. In general, I found that even if you're not planning to take forward English at all, it's really fantastic for giving you skills of analysis and really quite enjoyable as well, which is important. And it gives context to a lot of things that are very important, I think, to learn about in general.
So I take English literature and language, and I knew that I wanted to take English at A-level, but I wasn't sure sort of which route I was going to go down necessarily. And I think the deciding factor for me primarily was that I didn't want to study poetry at all. So I just wasn't a fan. I think GCSE kind of ruined it for me a little bit, unfortunately. But that was my main reason. And I really enjoy Lit and Lang. I think that it translates incredibly well to other subjects. If you do history or politics, it's very connected to both the past and kind of modern current events. We do the society and the individual module, which is really interesting. It kind of helps to shape your worldview and how literature and language kind of are so important to culture. And I think it's important that like literature and language is very different from language at GCSE. I think the texts are a lot better. It's more technical as well. So I do enjoy that element of it. And it's not just newspapers for the non-fiction, it is like podcasts and interviews and scripts and things like that. So you're not just going to be constantly like reading articles, which is good.
Hi, I'm Emily. I take English literature, and I think it's quite different from GCSE, although it's like mostly the same. It's a lot more in detail, like the context, things like that, and critics, because we never did critics at GCSE. So I think that's the main difference. That's sort of like other people's views, or like a feminist reading, historical reading, things like that, which is quite interesting, especially when you look at historical readings. So obviously 12th Night is very different now, like we perceive it quite differently to how they would have seen it. So it's interesting to think, oh, how would that audience have seen it? How would the audience 100 years ago have seen it? Things like that. And I picked Lit over Lang Lit because I prefer the novels, to be honest. I think they're more, well, they're more, not necessarily more classic, but they're more me. So I really enjoy it. For my coursework, I wrote about Oscar Wilde, as most people at Reigate do. And I think it was really interesting because obviously he's quite iconic. So coming forwards now, I know a lot about history, even though I don't necessarily take history. I think it's a good educational, gives you a broad essay writing perspective.
So I do literature and language, and I find that it gave me like a wide range in helping with my other subjects as well. So I do media and photography, and I feel like by doing language and literature, you're looking at modern texts as well as classics. So with the Voices anthology, which you'll study, you do a wide range of stuff. So it's like articles, podcasts. So I feel like that gives you a lot of skills that you don't necessarily get from the likes of like Shakespeare, which we do study as well, but you get a wide range of different skills. And I love the coursework aspect of it as well, because it gives you like free reign to produce like your own content that's both non-fiction and fiction. So I found that really interesting as well.
Okay, well, thank you everyone, and I'm hoping you found that I'm sure you did find that useful from to see the reasons why students choose one course over another, and some of it was useful to hear actually the differences from GCSE to A level, and the changes and the differences as you move on onto the course. So we are going to now have a sort of mini lesson on a John Keats sonnet. Now, you may have received in the post and by email a task sheet which asks you to read the poem, and there's just some sort of general sort of prompt questions for you to consider. So if you've done that, that's great. If you haven't, equally, it's not a problem at all. But it's just, again, that preparation, because what we do a lot in English is set for reading before the lesson, so you know in advance the lesson that's coming up, and then reading it in advance just gives you that sort of confidence and that sort of assurance that what's coming up. So this is the poem, and it's written by John Keats in 1817, and it is a sonnet, and it's called On the Sea. So on the right-hand side, there's the definition of some of the unusual or unfamiliar words. I'm just going to read this out, and then we're going to move on to a task. It keeps eternal whisperings around desolate shores, and with its mighty swell gluts twice 10,000 caverns, till the spell of Hecate leaves them their old shadowy sound. Often 'tis in such gentle temper found, that scarcely will the very smallest shell be moved for days from where it sometime fell, when last the winds of heaven were unbound. O ye, who have your eyeballs vexed and tired, feast them upon the wideness of the sea. O ye, whose ears are dinned with uproar rude, or fed too much with cloying melody, sit ye near some old cavern's mouth and brood, until ye start as if a sea nymph's choired. So, first of all, the first thing we do in an English lesson nearly always is to examine and explore and discuss what the ideas are in the text, to focus on meanings initially. And from that springs everything else. Meanings are central to our understanding of the text, obviously. And so just to help illustrate that, we have set up a poll. Now this, which will come up in a moment, and this is entirely anonymous. All we see is a percentage of answers. And I'd just be interested to see out there in Zoom land what your thoughts are regarding what Keats particularly admires about the sea. Some of the answers, there's more than one potential answer, but I'm going to ask you to choose just one, the one that stands out to you the most, or the one you agree with the most regarding what Keats particularly admires about the sea. So the poll should be coming up now. And yes, go and vote. It's interesting seeing all the votes coming in. There's a couple that are stretching ahead. I'll just give you another 10 seconds or so. Okay. There we go. So hopefully you can see these results as you have voted. We can see here that I think the one in the lead with 31% of votes is he admires the sublime scale and force of the sea. Coming close behind that is the sea provides solace and an escape from the pressures and challenges of living in this world. I'm pleased to see that nobody voted for Keats enjoys surfing, so he inevitably enjoys popping down to the coast. So it is. I put that in deliberately, obviously, because just to illustrate that it is possible to be wrong in English. There's more than one right answer, but there's also wrong answers as well. Edouard, what are your thoughts on this poem? What do you think Keats admires about the sea?
So in this poem, for sure, it's like full of a lot of contrasts, and in particular, he brings it up a lot in how he talks about the sea. It's both sublime and incredibly powerful and of gentle temper, and this contrast and sort of coexisting two forces, I think he really admires, and he wants other people to admire it as well.
Thank you. So that's one particular perspective on the poem of Edouard focusing on the contrasts in the attitude towards the sea. So that's the first thing we do in an English lesson. We would then discuss that with other students in the class, would have different views, as we saw from that poll, and then we'd tease out and establish what some of the main ideas are in the poem. Another important thing we do on the English course is to contextualize the text. So put it in its historical, social, political and literary context. Now, this poem was written, as I say, in 1817, and it is at the height, really, of the Romantic movement in arts and literature at the beginning of the 19th century. Edouard, again, is going to talk a little bit about some of the things that she has covered when considering Romanticism in literature.
So in terms of what we study in literature, we also study Frankenstein, which is also considered in many ways a romantic novel and was written in a similar time period. A lot of it, because it arose from a time that was very industrial, it was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it was the height of things becoming more and more drawn away from nature, Romanticism kind of emerged as the antithesis of this. So they really were keen to get people back to nature, as you might see in this sonnet, for example. Frankenstein, in very similar ways, is drawn to nature and consistently comes back to how beautiful the surroundings are. But in this poem especially, it really shines that it was important of Romanticism to really focus on the emotions that came from the individual and the nature, the world around them, if they stop to admire it.
Brilliant, thank you so much. That was a very detailed summary. And yeah, so Romanticism, this is a summary here, but Edouard's was much better, so just focus on that. So what we then do is not a matter of just saying, yes, this is a romantic poem, and Edouard has already done that. She's making the links between Romanticism and the poem itself. And so one question we would ask then is, what is Keats instructing the reader to do at the end of a poem, and why? And can you link this with some features of romantic art and literature? So at the end of the poem here, in these final 6 lines, he's asking the readers, or even almost commanding the readers, to feast upon the wideness of the sea. And to look upon nature as a source of nourishment and a source of solace for what is otherwise a difficult and troubled kind of world. Especially in the line, whose ears are dinned with uproar rude, that might be a suggestion there of the industry of urban, modern living, and how this looking at the sea will be enough to get him through, or to get us through. So therefore linking the ideas of the poem with those romantic contexts. Another thing we consider is form, which I know is obviously a part of the GCSE English Literature course as well. This, as I mentioned, is a sonnet. A sonnet is a 14-line poem. I'm not going to spend too much time going through the history and the details of the sonnet, but it's worth looking at this, because most sonnets, certainly a Petrarchan sonnet, as this one is, an Italian sonnet, can be divided between an octave and a sestet. So octave being the first 8 lines and the sestet being the final 6 lines. And between the two, between lines 8 and 9, there is what we call a volta, which is Italian for turn. So it's a turning point in the poem. And we can see it clearly here. So we've got the first 8 lines are a description of the sea. The first 4 lines, how mighty it is, and then followed by the gentle, small shell being unmoved, and so on. And then there's the turn, O ye, that announces the change in the poem. And suddenly and immediately we are addressed as the reader. And it's telling us what we should do with this vision of the sea. And so clearly we've got how the form of the poem is very cleverly and clearly embedded and embodied with the poem's ideas. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about that in the lesson. And then we're at the stage, having got a sense of the text, what it means, its ideas, its contexts, perhaps its form. We can explore some of the methods and some of the meanings behind those methods, or how those techniques add to the meanings. This is an area which many students find they're on familiar territory. I'm sure at GCSE you're getting stuck into some metaphors and the occasional adjective and so on. And so we build on that in the A-level English Literature course. So we start with the familiar, but we do stretch out and go into some of the more complex methods and techniques that writers can use. So I'm just going to pass over now to Emily, who, and I suppose the question is, are there any words, phrases, or images used to describe the sea that particularly stand out to you? Which is one of the questions on the task sheet, which you may have received. So, yeah, Emily, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the personification in the first line is particularly important. So it keeps eternal whisperings. Obviously, the sea can't whisper, so him saying it's whispering, it's personifying it. But then it's particularly interesting given the solemn mood of the poem overall, because like he's breathed life into such a miserable scene, although it's very sad, like tempestuous, etc. It's still alive, and he's sort of saying, you know, the sea reflects our moods. So it's sort of if you're upset, go to the sea. Well, a bit more complicated than that, I hope. But in a sort of like in a way that the sea will breathe with you.
Good. Yes, so very good. So it's saying the sea will breathe with you, you say. Yeah, that's fantastic. So the personification of the sea makes the links between the sea and the observer much more kind of intimate, I suppose. So yeah, that's a great idea. Here are some. You know, you may have found more if you completed this task on the task sheet. We've got the personification throughout. I've identified gentle temper as personification, but of course, eternal whisperings, as Emily identified, is another example. I think the octave does contain that contrast. You've got the first sentence really, ending with shadowy sound. That first 4 lines is the mightiness, and as I said earlier, when they got the smallest shell and gentle temper. It's suggesting the extremes of the sea through those contrasts, and the variety of the experience. We have hyperbole, the deliberate exaggeration. Gluts tries 10,000 caverns. That word gluts is interesting because that links to this the imagery in this poem is very sensuous. It appeals to the senses, and there's lots of eating imagery. You've got feast, cloying, and gluts, and which is a typical feature of John Keats's writing. It's called synesthesia. So describing the melody, the noise, the sound as though it's something to be eaten, which is characteristic of John Keats and of wider Romantic movement. We've got the command at the end: "Sit ye near some old cavern's mouth until ye start, until you wake up, until you're aware of the world around you." So the commanding as sentence structure helping with that. That is a brief example of the sort of things, the sort of methods that we might consider when we're working through and tracking through a text on the English literature course. One of the distinguishing features, as I mentioned earlier on the literature course, is this alternative readings, alternative perspectives. And when we look at, for example, Twelfth Night on the English literature course, we look at it through the prism, as it were, of what other people have to say about it, what other critics, what their views are, and using those critics to help form and shape and evaluate our own sort of interpretations. So we've got three views here. Early reviewers of Keats were not positive. Keats was, he had a few friends, he had a few advocates, but largely he wasn't read much in his own time, and he died at a tragically young age. I think he's 26. And the critics didn't like him very much. He said, "Here lies one whose name is writ in water." So the idea that he expected that his name wouldn't survive, wouldn't last because of all these bad reviews. One critic said, criticized Keats as a fanciful, dreaming tea drinker who lacked the intelligence to analyze a single idea or imagination enough to form one original image. So they would look at this poem and say, well, it's saying something fairly obvious about the sea. I've read things about the sea like that before. It's nothing new. What are you talking about? It was only after he died, and especially the Victorians, the early and mid-Victorians and the Pre-Raphaelites, they were particularly part of the kind of revival of Keats as a poet of sensuous richness and vivid pictorial effects. And more recently, in the 20th, 21st century, critics have admired the way Keats radically engages with class, politics, and economics. So there are three views there. So, Edouard, what are your thoughts? How do you respond to those critical perspectives?
The early reviewers of Keats do have a point in the sense that his style was really quite unconventional for what had been up until then. The Romanticist, when he wrote, the movement was really quite young, and his style now, while we might see it as something that resonates more with us, the historical context of it becomes quite clear why he would be seen as fanciful dreaming and lacking the intelligence to analyze a single idea. Even in this poem, he does go between ideas. We were exploring contrasts and the turns, just the last slide. It's difficult to categorize, perhaps, in a way that previous poetry might have been better at. So although it's a possibly cruel statement, it makes sense why it would have come out of that context and time.
Thank you, Edouard. So, sort of broad, it is possible to agree, but not be as critical, and with that first perspective. Emily, have you got any thoughts on in relation to this?
I definitely agree more with the second perspective, especially since the first one's, outstandingly harsh. I think the richness particularly stands out. Even though this is talking about nature, it also almost seems decadent, and like he's indulging in the sea, so things like that.
So and John Keats was admired by the kind of late 19th century decadent movement for exactly that reason. Yeah, the sort of immersion and wallowing in these feelings and these senses and these ideas. So yeah, very good. So that was a glimpse, a 15-minute glimpse into the sort of things that we cover on the English literature course. So I'm hoping that that there's some clarity forming in terms of what we do, and perhaps also you've now emerged with a slightly more detailed and perceptive understanding of the poem along the way. So we're now moving on to the language initiative. I've changed the colour to purple to illustrate that. Again, this would have been sent out to many or all of you. And this is an article which is from the Voices anthology, which we heard mentioned half an hour ago. So this is a text that is studied on the English language and literature course. And we'll be focusing on an extract from the text today, and it's from an article from the Guardian newspaper by Charlie Brooker, the English satirist and broadcaster. You might recognise him. He created the Black Mirror TV series and he's on TV a bit, or less so recently. In this article, he is explaining why he has decided to stop writing a weekly opinion column. And the extract we're focusing on is where he writes about the reader comments, which is the facility for online readers to read an article online and then write comments underneath it, called below the line. And so obviously getting immediate comments, immediate feedback on his article as soon as it gets published. So I'm just going to read this out. Too much talk for one planet, why I'm reducing my word emissions. Reader comments form part of the overall word storm, and it's true I'm not a huge fan of them, but that's chiefly because I'm an elderly man from the age of steam who clings irrationally to the outmoded belief that articles and letters pages should be kept separate, like church and state. I guess conceptually, I still think I'm writing in a newspaper, even though the reality of what that means has changed beyond measure since I started doing it. So now I'm sitting grumpily in a spaceship with my arms folded, wearing a stovepipe hat. Ridiculous. These days, most newspaper sites are geared towards encouraging interaction with a minuscule fraction of readers who bother to interact back, which is a pity because I'm selfishly uninterested in conducting any kind of meaningful dialogue with humankind in general. I'd say Twitter's better for back and forth discussion anyway, if you could be arsed with it. Yelling out of the window at passers-by is another option. Okay. So we have another poll coming up. Remember, it's completely anonymous, so just get stuck into it. This poll is asking you, what are Brooker's views on reader comments? So again, it's just one, just choose one that stands out to you or you agree with the most. Now, a couple of early leaders. I'll just give you another 10 seconds or so. See them racing in. Okay, just a few more seconds just trickling in. They're just about to think it's going to end and there's another one that comes up. I think we'll finish there, yes. So, the winner with an, well, yes, sharing results, sorry. The winner with an astonishing 37% is, he isn't bothered about what people have to say and it is the wrong forum for this kind of interaction. So that got the most. He's not a huge fan of them. That's also true. And it's also true to say he has old-fashioned views and thinks if people wish to make a comment, they should write a letter to the newspaper instead. So yeah, so there's a range of different responses, a range of different ideas. Liv, how do you respond to this, and what do you think is the main idea behind Brooker's article?
Well, I think that he's opposed to reader comments for like a number of reasons, but I think all of which stem from the fact that he comes from an older generation. But I think he presents this in quite like a satirical manner, and he's quite hyperbolic in some of the phrases that he uses, to insist that he's like too old and too in his ways to accept like the changing ways of the media. But I think that one of the biggest things is that the readers have more say than ever, and they can just comment on his work whenever they want. And I feel like that's something that he's not a huge fan of.
Yes, I think this sort of sense that he's sort of behind the times, as it were, and the world's moving on, and he's not sure it's moving on in all the right kind of directions. So great. So again, like in the John Keats poem, it is possible to be wrong. You know, there are sort of incorrect answers, but as we can see, there's different a range of different ideas here that Brooker is touching on in such a short extract. And so different readers will perhaps focus and emphasize different ideas. So for the John Keats sonnet, we focused on romanticism as a key context. Now, we do consider, when we look at the literary text on the language and literature course, again, literary contexts, such as Shakespearean tragedy for Othello, for example. But when we look at the text, the non-fiction text, especially in the Voices anthology, we consider other aspects of context as well. And especially things like genre, text type, so what type of text it is. In this case, obviously, it's an opinion column. What the purposes of a text might be, what is Charlie Brooker trying to achieve, and also who the audience is. And there's often different types of audience for any individual text, and with the audience that perhaps Charlie Brooker had in mind, or who he was expecting to read this article. So this third poll is more than one answer for this one. So you can choose whichever audience types you think is appropriate for this. So just to remind you that it appeared in the Guardian newspaper, and also obviously online on their online edition. You can, like I say, vote more than once. Okay, yeah, as always, there's a couple of clear racing ahead, some answers. Okay, I'll say 10 more seconds. Okay. And there we go. The answers are in, the results are in. We have with 56% readers of the Guardian app. Now that's a safe bet, that one, to continue with the metaphor. It appeared in the Guardian, and readers of the Guardian app are likely to be the people that like to read the article. Fans of Charlie Brooker. He is a bit of a celebrity, or is he well known as a writer and his opinion for his opinions, as well as his work in television. Of course, the headline might draw people in who might have an interest in language and social media. Twitter users as well, perhaps, and social media. Now, these last two are a little bit mean, these last two here, because The Guardian traditionally, the readership of The Guardian traditionally tends to be those who have sympathies with the left wing of politics. And that's the sort of thing that we cover in class in terms of, you know, the who's going to be the readers of these texts and who's the typical reader of The Guardian and so on. So, yeah. So, and then we think about how and to what extent the text has been influenced by who it's aimed at. And there's lots of, for example, assumed or prior knowledge about what reader comments are, for example, what Twitter is, and so the ways in which the audience have influenced the text, its ideas, and its language is something that we consider. The final poll of the evening is now coming your way, which is asking you to describe what you consider to be the overall tone of this extract. So if you could have a go at this. Just one answer for this one. How would you describe the tone of voice? Again, we've got three leaders here on this one. It's quite close. Okay, just 10 more seconds. Right. Okay, we'll finish there. And these are the results. There we go. Bitter. Everyone got a bitter. A very bitter tone, isn't it, in this one? It is also chatty and informal. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's interesting that 2% of you have identified it as being a formal tone. I think there are quite a number of elements of formality in this text, which we'll look at. Of course, it's funny. There's a humorous image which Booker uses at the center of this extract. And I'm pleased to see, I suppose, that nobody's written or identified loving as being the tone here or submissive. Like I say, there's there are different tones that we can identify, but I think you'd struggle to justify there's a loving tone here. So there we go. So we look for the sort of thing we work through. So again, we start with the text. We think about what it means, what its main ideas are. We then work through some of the context. On the language and literature course, there's different types of context that we might consider. And then we move on, like I say, like we already have done with some of the language. We're focusing on tone here, and then we get into, as it were, the language, the techniques, the methods, the aspects of vocabulary and grammar that form an important distinguishing part of this course. So, Alice, what are some of the techniques that you think Brooker is using in this extract?
So I'll probably initially start with kind of the most immediately obvious things, which I noticed. So first of all, you have this kind of extended metaphor throughout the piece, which we might call a semantic field of kind of ecology and emissions. And I think that's really important for kind of making his argument more convincing, as it kind of aligns morality in a sense to what we put out into the world. So kind of the things that we're saying, and sometimes people think of social media as sort of this void in which anything you say doesn't really affect things. But I think this is kind of hinting that it is more than that, and there is, you know, a sense of overwhelmingness to this as well. You have in the extract words like the metaphor word storm and steam. So that's again talking about kind of aligning talking and conversation and dialogue with climate change and things like that, which I think is interesting. And you also have this kind of juxtaposition between what is real and what isn't, what's conceptual. And that's obviously most evident in the metaphor and imagery of the kind of spaceship, which I think is really nicely contrast.
Thank you. That was yeah, very detailed and very precise summary. That's the semantic field, the idea, or an idea which kind of runs through or is threaded through the text, which relates to a particular area. So we've got here sort of like you say, word storm and emissions. I think, yeah, so that's a great point. What I've done here is just to demonstrate perhaps some of the differences in approach between Langlit and Lit. So we did obviously look at hyperbole and personification in the John Keats sonnet, and we do that a little bit on the Langlit course as well. But we also explore what we call sort of language framework, so the some of the nitty gritty, the forensic aspects of language. So here are some of the things that we might consider alongside what Alice has done very eloquently there. So we've got, first of all, we've got this informal colloquial expression, I guess, which adds obviously to that informal tone, which many of you identified as being an important part of this text. So I guess, that's the sort of thing we're more likely to say rather than write. But then that's immediately followed by this adverb, which is quite abstract. Well, it's abstract, I was talking about abstract. And it's quite formal, conceptually. So he's kind of balancing quite complex ideas with that engaging, chatty style, which and the language is clearly demonstrating that. And that is achieved in part through this complex sentence, through which he's developing a range of quite complex ideas about what a newspaper is, what a newspaper stands for, and what it has been and what it is today. And so is using a range of complex grammatical structures in order to explore those ideas. We could look at this, what's known as a fronted conjunction. That's when a conjunction is put at the beginning of a sentence, which is so here. And this, again, is perhaps part of this informal tone that he's going for, but also obviously it's developing his argument. We've got the humorous minor sentence. A minor sentence is a sentence which doesn't contain a verb at the end there, which functions almost like a punchline to the image, to the ridiculous image which Alice identified. We could also focus on things like the adverb of manner, grumpily, that kind of self-deprecating. He knows who he is. He's got his, as part of his kind of shtick, really. He's a grumpy man. That's his thing. And so he's imagining himself with his arms folded, sitting in this spaceship. And then we have this adverb of time, which obviously is suggesting how much things have changed by, and we've got now, which is an adverb of time, and how things are, it's emphasizing the contrast between things in the past and things in the present. Anyway, so there's a few, the sort of level of forensic detail of language analysis that we do on this course. Another thing which is unique to the language and literature course, as we heard earlier, is that you have opportunities to do your own creative writing. So one thing that might do, especially in the coursework sort of season, which normally is at the end of the first year, is to look at a text just as we have done, and then use that as a springboard to write or as inspiration to write your own text in response to it, or picking up some of the key ideas. So, for example, you might be asked to write a chapter, or you might choose, I should say, to write a chapter from a memoir describing your encounters with social media as a teenager, for example, using using the same tone or the same ideas in this Charlie Brooker article. As I mentioned, this article is studied on the language and literature course. And I've asked Alice just to talk through some of the things that she covered when she was taught or when she studied this lesson in class, which was last year.
Yeah, so I think most of what we picked up was about kind of this satirical, sarcastic tone, which is very much throughout the entire thing. And one thing that I think, based on the highlighting that I have in front of me, is I was particularly interested in, there's a part where it's sort of this hypothetical build-up about the responses and kind of the overwhelmingness of, I guess you call it like cancel culture and things like that. And there's this hypothetical build-up, and we do a lot of kind of, we talk about the forensics of language, so picking out sort of pre-modifying adjectives which help to kind of convey this message of him not particularly approving of outrage. There's outrage, despair, wry, things like that, which all pair with nouns to kind of intensify what he's saying, as well as triple structures. There's a triple structure which just lists events and noise, events and noise, events and noise, which I think is a nice, concise kind of syntax, which, like, to me encapsulates his whole message. Aside from that, this continued metaphor, which I spoke about already, and the self-deprecation, Olympic level navel gazing is one of the quotes that I got here, which is obviously kind of a hyperbole and it's self-deprecating in itself. So that's some of the things that we focused on.
Okay, well, yes, thank you very much for that. So I hope that's an insight into the sort of level, really, of on the language and literature course that Alice has provided there. So we don't start with that; we build that level of knowledge that Alice has demonstrated, and that's a knowledge and a confidence which builds over the 2 years of the course. And we make special care and attention in those first few weeks, where as you transition from GCSE to A level, to build on the things that you already know, to give you that confidence and slowly start to introduce these new and complex and more complex or advanced, that's what the A stands for in A level, more advanced thinking and ideas and knowledge and understanding. So I mentioned at the beginning that there's an opportunity for you to ask questions regarding English at Reigate College. And one question's come in here. Will there be any creative writing on English literature? The answer to that is no. I was going to offer it over, but it just says no. If you're really interested in creative writing, then language and literature perhaps is the one to consider. And there's an argument to be made that writing an essay is itself a creative act, but largely we can say that no is the answer to that one. Have another question here. Do you need to buy your own books? The books are provided for you like a library, really. They're issued for you for the duration of the course, which is obviously 2 years. And so at the beginning of your first year, you'll be issued your books, and then you keep hold of those, and then you return them at the end. You can't write in those books though, because it's like a library. So some students like to buy their own and write in those. Before of you, do you want to put your hand up if you've bought your own and you write in it? To half of you. So there you go. That's Alicia. Edouard is principled against writing in any books. So that's the one. We've got another question here. Is the creative writing that you do in the Langlit course only non-fiction, or can you write a fictional piece? Shall we offer that over? Liv, do you want to answer that one?
So in the Langlit course, you do 2 pieces of coursework, one of which is fiction and the other is non-fiction. So they're both 1,000 words each, and usually you get given a theme. This year it was home, so like I wrote a piece. Non-fiction was about one of my family members, and the fiction piece I based off of someone else moving away to a new home. So it would be something similar to that you would do.
This one, we do get asked this one a lot. This one is language and literature 2 separate A levels, or are they together? I think we should something which should be an asterisk on the title of the course. Language and literature. It's reasonable to assume, but it's two A levels because it's got the word "and" in it. But what it is it's a combination, and it's what we call an integrated approach. So it's looking at language primarily through a range of texts, including literature. And that's one summary. But in a short answer to the question, it is 1 A level. The level of demand is the same as English literature. The level of assessment is the same as English literature, and then the amount of teaching hours and homework and everything is exactly the same as English literature. So so that's answering that one. So this one for Alice. There's lots of Langlit questions. Is all the assessed creative writing done outside the exam as coursework?
Yeah, so the only creative writing that you do on the course is the coursework, and you sort of talk that through a lot. You have like brainstorming sessions with your teacher, and then you do sort of write it on your own. It's very much an individual thing, but you get help and you discuss it in a lot of detail. But yeah, it's only coursework creative.
Thank you. We have I just got this fairly detailed question, but it's a good one, so I'm going to read the whole thing out. I wanted to choose English literature and language. Language, as I find myself into non-fictional subjects and would enjoy doing the coursework, although the fictional writing I'm much with. But I really enjoy classical texts, so literature would be ideal, but it is not my strong suit. Got to get some advice as to how I can decide what I should do. I wonder if this person came to the open evening. If the focus here is on your own, what you enjoy doing the most, that helps you to decide which course to do. You say here that you enjoy. It's gone. Yeah, you say here that you enjoy non-fiction and you enjoy writing. So that would suggest that Langlit is the one that's calling out to you, and you see you distinguish between that and classical text and literature. On the language and literature course, we study Othello, we study The Great Gatsby, we study translations, and we study a range of literary non-fiction extracts as well. So if that comes under the definition of classical literature, then that might so language and literature might be the one that you might want to consider. And yeah, so another question, which books will be studied? Let's bring in a literature student here. Emily, what text do you study on the literature course?
So for Shakespeare you do Twelfth Night, and then for coursework you do Oscar Wilde, but I don't know if that's going to be the same. And then also a comparison of modern text, well, a modern text-ish, Frankenstein and The Handmaid's Tale, and then now we're doing poetry. So you do modern poetry, not modern poetry, it's called Poems of the Decade. It's quite modern-ish.
Yeah.
And then John Donne, which is 16th century, and other and A Streetcar Named Desire. I feel like there's another one.
That's it. Yeah. So yeah, they're the texts on the English literature course. So in the first year, we look at Frankenstein, The Handmaid's Tale, the Poems of the Decade that Emily mentioned, and Twelfth Night. They're the 4 texts the first year. John Donne, Streetcar, and coursework largely in the second year. Another question here. What GCSE grades would be recommended for English literature? The entry requirements are you need to have a grade 5 in English literature and a grade 5 in English language, as well as the college entry requirements, which is 5 GCSEs grade 4 or above. So that's what you need to do that, and students who have those minimum entry requirements go on to achieve high grades on this course. So So yeah, if you meet the entry requirements, you can come on and do the course and be a success. So that's not a problem. Does one course look better on university applications than another? Short answer is no. English literature has been around a bit longer, so some people might recognise it a little bit more than language and literature. We're just looking at our destinations data for students who left last year, and we had a student on English language and literature who went to Cambridge to study politics. So yeah, it doesn't matter. It's the one that you want to do the most. We have a question here. How many English lessons are there in a week? Alice.
So there's 2 a week, but they're 2 hours long each. So essentially 4 hours a week.
There we go. We also have, you'll be expected to do about 4 hours a week outside of lessons as well, which is a combination of homework and what we call structured learning. So the commitment per subject is about 8 hours a week. So most students do 3 subjects, so that's 8, 16, 24 hours. And of that, 4 hours a week will be in lessons. So any final questions? Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, this one here. What universities and degrees do students with English go on to do? Do you want to perhaps just very briefly just go through and just say what you're going to do when you leave, what you're hoping to do when you leave Reigate College? We'll start with Ada.
I will be studying politics, philosophy, and economics.
I've decided to study classics, and the kinds of universities that I applied to or got offers from. I received my offer for Oxford a couple of weeks ago, and Edinburgh, Bristol, all these kinds of Russell Group universities are really happy to accept Lang and Lit students.
I've applied for politics, philosophy, and economics, the same as Edward, and I'm really excited about it. I think you can go anywhere with English, really.
And I've chosen to apply for media and communications as my degree, and I feel like Lit and Lang has helped with that a lot.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for again clarifying that language and literature, there's no distinction. Yeah, so a range of destinations, and as we just heard, English opens doors. You can go on to do almost anything with an English A level. Not just English, but it helps spread across, and it helps to give you the skills to be successful in other courses, as for example, Liv is going on to do media and communications, and obviously the English A level is really will help her a lot with that degree and that career. Okay, we've got the last 2 questions. This is a good question. This is one for students, for one of you 4 to answer. Is it a good idea to have read the books we study beforehand, or is it better to hear it for the first time in class? There might be different answers here. Adwa, what do you think?
I think it's worth getting your hands on before the class. I must admit there was like 1 or 2 that I hadn't read before class, and I found that when I had read it before, it allowed me to engage with it in the lesson in a different capacity. So basically, doing it more times will make you better at it. So it is worth it, especially if you enjoy English as a course, then there's no reason why you shouldn't.
Yeah, I would agree with that answer. So I think that's a good answer to read in advance, which leads on to this next question. Any suggested reading you should do to prepare for Lang Lit? So if bearing in mind your own experience, so someone who's in the middle of their year 11, who's thinking or hoping to do English language and literature, knowing now what you know, what would you advise them to do or read? Alice, do you want to go?
Well, I would say, just in response to the previous question as well, depends on the kind of learner you are. Maybe you find it too overwhelming, and we do go through it chapter by chapter in class, or scene by scene in class as well. Maybe I would recommend looking at kind of historical context and things like that, which are going to really aid your reading of it. Particularly for Gatsby and Othello, I think learning a bit about kind of how it was written and why and under what context is probably the most useful thing. But I would say just practice reading things that you enjoy. It doesn't matter like what it is at all, just anything that you're reading is perfectly acceptable. And yeah, if you wanted to have a look at kind of modernist novels in preparation for Gatsby, because I found it quite a new reading experience, it is certainly something that can be a little bit difficult if you haven't, but as I say, you go through in class, so it's not too bad. But yeah, maybe I would say modernist.
Okay, that's a great answer. I think just read anything that interests you. It's a reading course, effectively, both of the A levels. And so the more you read, just read what you enjoy. Perhaps pick up a book again. Perhaps I work from speaker to students often on open evening. There's perhaps read a lot up to the age of about 12 or 13, and then it suddenly starts dropping off. So perhaps we can kind of bring that back or rejuvenate that interest in reading, which will put you in a really strong position on the course. Last question. This is definitely the last question. Are you able to use any of the rooms or any rooms after class times or between class times for studying? That's a good question. Okay,
We have the ILC, which is an independent learning centre. So it's like a library. You can use it after class. I'm pretty sure it's open all day from about 8 until 5. And there's desks with computers that you can use. You can bring your own laptop, you can bring whatever you want, as long as you're quiet. And I think there's plenty of space around college to study, really. You can study in the ref anywhere. And when it's warm, it's quite nice to sit outside and study as well.
Okay, well, I think that's the end of the question and answer session, and which brings the event to a close. So I'd like to thank you all out there in Zoom land for your contributions to the question and answer session, and also the polls as well, to give you some indication of some, or a hint of a sort of engagement and interaction that happens typically in an English lesson. And I'd like to thank Alice, Edouard, Emily and Liv for helping out this evening as well. Have a good representation of the course and of the college. So yeah, so look forward to meeting you in August, September. Good luck with your GCSEs, and I hope you get the results that you're hoping for, and all the best. Thank you.